I stood in front of the mirror for far too long. Not because I didn't know what to wear, I always knew. My wardrobe was predictable, built for function and quiet elegance, stitched in neutral tones and proper lengths. But that morning, I lingered. Something restless moved under my skin like a faint pulse in a forgotten limb. The lace caught my eye first. Black, delicate, almost inappropriate under a soft beige sweater and wool trousers. It wasn't a set I'd bought for my husband, Shire. Fact, I couldn't remember why I'd bought it at all. Perhaps just to remind myself I was still capable of wanting to feel beautiful beneath all this structure. Married life hadn't stripped me of desire, but it had wrapped it in silence. No one told me that longing could wither without drama, just through repetition and the absence of being seen. He wasn't cruel. My husband, he was stable, kind in ways that didn't involve words. He worked hard, came home on time, paid attention to practicalities. But he hadn't touched my lower back in months. Not out of punishment, just he forgot that I existed as a woman. I became someone to coordinate schedules with, to split bills, to share coffee machines. We never fought. We didn't need to. There was nothing sharp between us anymore, just stillness. We were invited to dinner at my mother's house. A routine gathering, the kind that begins with lukewarm wine and ends in predictable farewells at the door. But this time, there was a presence in the air, a shift I couldn't explain. Maybe it was because her husband, my stepfather, was back in town. He rarely stayed long, always had business somewhere, always a suitcase by the door. I never liked or disliked him. He was just there. Quiet, with hands that looked like they belonged to someone who worked outside, even though he didn't. He greeted me with a nod. No kiss on the cheek, no embrace. He wasn't the affectionate type, and I was glad. Touch would have been too much. But when I passed behind his chair, I noticed he adjusted the cuff of his shirt, cleared his throat, avoided my eye. It meant nothing. And it meant too much. Dinner was its usual monotony. Mother dominated the conversation. My husband nodded in all the right places, and I stirred my wine with the stem of the glass. The light above the dining table buzzed faintly, casting a yellow sheen over everything as if we were suspended in old film at. One point I reached for the salt at the same moment he did. Our fingers brushed skin to skin. An accident, really. Yet neither of us withdrew. Just a second too long. Maybe two. I looked at him. He looked at the salt on the drive home. My husband hummed something. Tuneless. He didn't notice I hadn't spoken since dessert. My thoughts weren't even on what had happened. There was nothing to dissect. But my skin still remembered the exact pressure of his hand on mine. The absurdity of it. A simple touch. Like someone brushing past you in a crowded elevator. But the sensation lingered like heat. That night I stood under the shower longer than necessary. Steam curled around the ceiling. Fogged the mirror, made everything soft and blurred. I closed my eyes and let the water fall between my breasts down my stomach. The lace lingerie still lay crumpled on the edge of the laundry basket. I hadn't let my husband see it, I don't know why. Or maybe I do. When I slipped into bed, he was already asleep, one hand resting on his chest, the other curled beside his pillow. I watched him for a moment. We used to touch feet under the blanket. He used to trace circles on my thighs with half-dreamy hands. But now we slept like strangers in a hotel room, polite, distant parallel. I turned my face toward the wall, feeling my own breath warm the pillow. There was nothing to feel guilty about. There was no affair. No words exchanged. Just a moment unspoken and undecided. But the lace, the pause, the silence at dinner, something had shifted. Not in the world, in me. And the strangest part, I didn't want to fix it. I wanted to feel it again. I didn't plan to wake up. Not like that. Not in that moment between dream and breath, where the body starts before the mind. But something stirred me. Maybe the dryness in my throat or the creaking floorboard beyond our bedroom door. I lay still for a second, listening. The kind of silence that fills a house in the middle of... The night isn't empty, it hums, it waits. I slid from the sheets without waking him. My husband had always been a deep sleeper, the kind who could sleep through sirens and storms. I envied that about him, his peace, his detachment. I wrapped a robe around me. Even though the night air was warm and padded softly down the hallway toward the kitchen, I didn't turn on the lights. The refrigerator hum was the only sound. That and the faint clink of glass. I stopped in the doorway. He was standing there. My stepfather. Dressed in a plain gray t-shirt and loose dark pants, barefoot like he'd lived in this house all his life. He hadn't seen me yet. He was rinsing something in the sink. His back turned, his movement slow and deliberate. I could have turned around, I could have walked away and pretended I hadn't seen him, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe and watched, not out of boldness. Curiosity, maybe, or something older than that. Something I hadn't let breathe in years. He turned his head just slightly. His profile caught the moonlight through the kitchen window. Then, without any greeting, he reached into the cabinet, pulled out 2 glasses and filled them both with water. He didn't speak. Just pushed one of the glasses slightly across the counter toward me. I stepped forward and took it. Our fingers not touching this time, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off his hand. I should have said something polite, something neutral, but the silence between us had become something dense and textured like fog. It wasn't awkward, it was waiting, watching. I sipped the water slowly, using the act as an excuse to look away from his eyes. Then he spoke, quiet but clear. You couldn't sleep either? I nodded. No point in pretending. My throat was tight, my fingers curled around the glass harder than necessary. It's hot. I replied barely above a whisper. The air. He looked at me for a long moment, then gave a small nod and turned his gaze to the window. There was nothing out there but the dark silhouette of the garden and the dim glow from a neighbor's porch, but he looked at it like it meant something, like he was trying to remind himself where. I used to come out here all the time. He said after a while, eyes still on the window. When your mother first moved in, couldn't sleep in her bed, it didn't smell like mine yet. I didn't answer, I didn't know what to say. The image of him alone in this kitchen, years ago, before I ever thought of him as more than a formality in our family gatherings, startled me. Not because it was inappropriate, because it made him human. He turned back toward me slowly. There was no smile, no suggestion, just presence. He studied my face the way one looks at a photograph, not for what's obvious, but for what might have changed in the background. You cut your hair. He said, months ago. I replied, he nodded again, but it wasn't about the haircut. He was seeing me, really seeing me, for what felt like the first time in longer than I could remember. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't seductive. It was unbearable. I stepped away from the counter, just one small step. But it was enough to close the space between us. I looked at him then, not like someone I was related to, not like someone my mother had married. I looked at him as a woman, and for 1 second, he looked back the same way. There was no warning, no lean in, no clever exchange or symbolic gesture. My body moved before I could think. I kissed him. Soft. Just once. My lips barely brushing his. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to feel if he would pull away. He didn't. He stood. Still. No movement. No return. Just stillness. I stepped back suddenly, aware of everything. The cold tile under my feet, the sound of water still dripping from the sink, the rapid beat of my own pulse in my throat. He didn't say a word. He didn't touch me. He simply looked at me with the same calm as before, and then slowly, without drama, turned back to rinse his glass. Then he walked past me without brushing against me, without a glance. I stood alone in the kitchen, the taste of water and salt and something electric still on my lips. My hands were trembling, and I hated that they were. It wasn't shame, it wasn't guilt, it was hunger. Not for him, but for the part of myself I had buried so long ago I forgot it had. teeth, I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay beside my husband, listening to the slow rhythm of his breath, staring into the ceiling as if it might speak back. He didn't stir, didn't notice the way I curled in on myself. He never did. In the morning, everything returned to its place. Coffee brewed. Toast was made. My husband kissed my temple and asked about my plans. I smiled and told him I had errands. I didn't say a word about the kitchen, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, not the kiss. Not him, just the fact that I had done it, that I had wanted to, and even more dangerously that I wanted to feel it again. I tried to stay away from him, not out of morality, not even fear, but because I didn't trust myself. I knew what I was capable of now, not in theory, but in action. One step into a quiet kitchen, and I had already undone a piece of myself. Not because it had been dramatic, precisely because it hadn't. There was no affair. Not yet. But I'd crossed a threshold I couldn't name. For 2 days, I distracted myself. I cleaned things that didn't need cleaning, rearranged spices, scheduled appointments I had no interest in attending. I even sat through dinner with my husband and pretended to care about his recounting of some meeting. He looked at me the same way he always did, present calm, but not searching for anything in me. And it struck me then, maybe that's all I ever needed, to be searched. On the 3rd day, it rained. Not a soft drizzle, but a hard, insistent downpour that made the city feel like it was shrinking in on itself. Traffic lights blurred behind soaked windshields and pedestrians huddled like survivors I didn't want. To be at work that day, my body was somewhere else entirely, weightless, restless. I kept looking at the clock, tapping my fingers on the desk, watching the water collect on the window ledge. I left early. There was no real reason, I told my assistant. I had a headache, and she nodded sympathetically. But the truth sat deeper beneath my ribs and my stomach, in the tremor at the edge of my breath. When I stepped outside, the air was thick and alive. Rain was everywhere, bouncing off hoods, splashing in gutters, dripping from traffic signs like sweat. I didn't have an umbrella. I didn't care. I was halfway across the parking lot when I saw the car. It was his. I recognized the scratch on the side door, a diagonal line that looked like someone had run a key across it years ago. He was inside, watching me through the glass. The wipers moved in slow rhythm, clearing just enough space for our eyes to meet. I stopped. My first instinct was to pretend I hadn't seen him. Walk. Past, keep going. But something pulled at me. Not him. Me. He lowered the passenger side window halfway. I walked to the car before I'd made a decision. He didn't say hello. He just looked at me and unlocked the door. I got in, the inside of his car smelled like rain and leather, faint tobacco, though I'd never seen him smoke. The dashboard lights glowed faintly, illuminating his face from beneath sharp jawline, tired eyes, that same unreadable stillness. You following me now? I asked. He shook his head once, slow. I was nearby, saw you come out. That's not an answer. I don't have one. He said. We sat in silence for a while. The rain drummed against the roof, steady, relentless. The kind of sound that fills the air so completely, it makes everything else quieter by contrast. He didn't reach for me. He didn't touch me. He just looked straight ahead, both hands on the steering wheel, like we were about to go somewhere. Only there was no destination. Turned toward him, my voice lower now. Are we going to pretend that nothing happened? I'm not pretending anything. He said, you kissed me, and you let me. He turned to me, then really turned. His eyes weren't angry. They were clear, alert. You think I haven't wanted to? You think I haven't imagined it more times than I should admit? His voice wasn't loud, but it hit like something physical, a confirmation, a violation, a relief. My throat went dry. I looked, away out at the blurred shapes of moving people, the red and green lights smeared by water on the windshield. Everything looked distant, like another life. I leaned back in my seat. I didn't plan it. I said, I didn't walk into that kitchen thinking about you. You don't have to explain. I'm not explaining. I'm admitting. He didn't respond right away. Then quietly. So now what? It was the question I'd been avoiding since the moment I touched him. There was no plan, no escape route, but everything in my body ached toward something I couldn't name. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. So I reached for the window button and raised the glass, shutting out the sound of the storm. And then I said the only thing I could: drive. He did. We didn't go far. Just through the neighborhood, past the places I knew too well. Past the dry cleaner where I picked up his shirts, past the coffee shop where I once cried into a cappuccino because I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at me and meant it. Inside the car there was no music, no small talk, just the sound of rain on metal and the hush between breaths. At a red light, I looked at him again. Did you think about it after? He didn't pretend not to understand. Yes. Did you regret it? No. I looked back at the road, neither did I. He parked a block from my house. No one spoke. He didn't offer to walk me, I didn't ask. There was an understanding between us now, raw, unfinished, but real. Before I opened the door, I paused. I don't know what I'm doing. I said, I know. He replied, but you're doing it anyway. I nodded, once stepped out and shut the door behind me. By the time I reached the front porch, the rain had already soaked through my clothes. My hair clung to my neck. My shoes squelched against the tiles. But I felt more alive than I had in months. Inside, my husband was making tea. He looked up surprised. You're soaked, he said. Got caught. I replied. He handed me a towel, kissed my cheek absently, and turned back to the kettle. I dried my hands and stared out the kitchen window, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I belonged here. Not because I was lost, because I had finally started choosing where I wanted to be. I woke before sunrise the next morning, not because of a sound or dream, but because something inside me refused to let the day begin without acknowledgement. I sat up in bed, slowly, careful not to disturb the man beside me. He breathed steadily, his chest rising and falling with the same measured rhythm it always had. My hand hovered for a moment above his shoulder, unsure whether I wanted to touch him out of habit or apology. In the end, I let it fall back into my lap. Downstairs, the house felt sterile in its quietness. The coffee machine hissed and clicked as I stood in the kitchen wearing one of my looser sweaters and no bra underneath. Not as a statement, just because I didn't want to feel anything tight against my body. I wasn't sure if I wanted to feel anything at all. The message came just before 8 from my mother. Are you free today? He's fixing the window in the back room. Could use some help sorting boxes if you're up for it. I stared at the text longer than necessary. The wording wasn't unusual, the tone familiar, but I felt the shift in my gut. It wasn't the request. It was the context I couldn't ignore anymore. Every interaction now had a shadow. Every room he occupied suddenly felt like a risk. I answered with a simple yes. I didn't tell my husband. I said I'd be running errands, maybe dropping by Mom's for a bit. He nodded, reading the paper already, mentally drifting into his day. We kissed goodbye the way people do who've long forgotten to linger at my mother's house. The air smelled like old linen and warm dust, a kind of comfort that belonged to another version of me, the version who used to come here without checking for certain footsteps, the version who never stood still in the hallway just to listen for the sound of his voice in the other room. He was in the back, hunched over a frame, prying at the aged wood with something that looked like a flathead screwdriver. The sunlight hit his shoulder at an angle that made the gray in his hair seem like silver, rather than age. He didn't turn around when I entered. You came? He said, not looking up. You asked? A faint smile ghosted across his face. Barely visible, boxes were already stacked against the far wall, some open, some still taped shut. Old things, holiday decorations, photo albums, blankets folded too many times to hold their shape. I started with the smallest box. It was easier to look at expired things than at him. For a while we didn't speak, just the occasional scrape of wood, the shifting of cardboard. But the silence wasn't hollow. It pulsed. Attention too ripe to ignore, but still wrapped in pretense. I found an old photo of me in college, short hair, wide smile, eyes that didn't yet know how disappointment collects in corners. I held it a second too long. He noticed. You were louder back then. he said, tapping the screwdriver against his palm. You used to argue with your mother about everything? She used to ask for it? I replied. Without thinking, he chuckled softly. You liked being right. I liked being heard. He didn't answer, but I saw something shift in his posture. He stood, stretched his back slightly, and wiped his hands on a cloth that used to be a kitchen towel. You want coffee? I nodded, and we moved into the kitchen together. That space my childhood kitchen hadn't changed. The same ceramic mugs lined the same chipped shelf, the table with one uneven leg, the chair I once carved initials into when I was 13. He poured the coffee in silence, handed me a cup, and leaned against the sink. We stood there like we'd done it 100 times before, and yet everything inside me screamed that nothing was normal. I've been trying to figure out when this started, I said, staring into the mug. He didn't ask what I meant. He never did. Nothing started. He said, don't lie. I'm not. I just don't have the answer you want. Do you want me? I asked. I didn't plan to. It came out like an exhale. He looked at me then. Not with surprise. Not even hesitation. I do. He said, but not the way you think. I don't want pieces. I don't want the version of you that sneaks out of rooms. I took a breath. It felt sharp in my chest. Not ready to be more than that. I know I'm still married. I know that too. The words hung there, suspended, honest. We didn't pretend. We didn't soothe. When I stood to rinse my mug, he moved behind me. Not touching, just presence close enough to feel. My back stiffened, then softened. I didn't move away. I can still smell your perfume from the car. He murmured, voice low. I turned around. The counter was at my back. His hand was at his side. He didn't reach for me. I didn't reach for him, but I didn't need to. We both knew that a distance once crossed, even silently, doesn't rebuild itself. Will you be here next week? I asked, pretending the question was casual. I might be, he said. But if I am, and if you come, you should stop wearing that perfume. Why? Because it makes it harder to pretend we're not already in this. I wanted to laugh, to say something clever, but my throat ached, and I didn't trust my voice. Instead, I gathered my things, stepped back into the fading afternoon, and walked to my car driving home. I realized I didn't remember what we'd talked about at all. Only how he said nothing and how that silence told me everything. Was the kind of afternoon that didn't belong to any season warm enough for short sleeves, but the air still held a crisp edge that clung to the skin. My mother had left town unexpectedly, a minor surgery for her sister in another city. She called in a rush. Flustered, asked me to check on the house while she was gone. The back room was still being worked on, and she didn't want the contractor, him, to be there alone. I didn't say yes right away. I told her I'd check my schedule, but we both knew I had none that mattered. By the time I arrived, the sun was sinking low, casting golden light through the kitchen windows and slicing the floor into long amber streaks. I parked farther down the street, unsure why. Maybe I didn't want to be seen, or maybe I didn't want to see myself walking up that path again with intention. The front door was unlocked. He had a key, of course. He'd been part of this household longer than I'd ever lived in it. The smell inside was familiar too: aged furniture, old varnish, faint citrus from the cleaner my mother had used since I was a child, but this time the scent was laced with something else. Anticipation, electricity. I found him in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch with a newspaper folded in his lap. He looked up as I stepped in, as if I were right on time, though we hadn't agreed on any. You came, he said simply. I told her I would. He nodded. I could see the shift in his eyes, the way they moved across my face, then down, as if trying not to be obvious. I'd worn a dark dress, nothing extravagant, but the fabric hugged more than it hid, and the line of my collar dipped just low enough that I'd noticed myself checking it twice before locking the car. For a few moments there was no script, no instructions. The space between us felt painfully loud. He gestured toward the kitchen. I made tea. The teapot sat on the stove, still steaming, 2 cups already out, though he hadn't poured. The stillness of it struck me like he'd been waiting but refused to look like he was. I moved closer, the sound of my own footsteps strangely sharp against the tile. "Why are we doing this?" I asked. My voice felt foreign, like it came from somewhere deeper than I meant. He leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "We're not doing anything yet." "But you want to. I'm not the only one." There it was. Truth stripped of metaphor. I didn't answer. I stepped past him, opened a cabinet to reach for a spoon, anything to break the rhythm of his gaze. When I turned around, he hadn't moved, just watched. "I think about it," I said finally, more than I should. "So do I." He, walked toward the table and sat. I followed slowly, like my body was remembering how to fit into this unfolding. The space between us was narrow now, smaller than before. Our knees almost touched. He didn't reach for my hand. He reached for a sugar cube and dropped it into his tea. The sound of it hitting the surface was absurdly loud. "I've had affairs before," I said. It surprised even me how easily it came out, how clear it sounded. He looked at me, not shocked, just still. None of them were worth anything. I continued. "Fleeting things. Validation maybe, but they never reached this point." "What point is that?" "The one where I have to lie to myself to stay away." We sat there for what felt like hours. The air between us was heavy, thick with everything unsaid. I watched him slowly move his thumb along the rim of his cup, that small, unconscious gesture that betrayed just how tightly he was keeping himself in check. When I stood, it wasn't dramatic. I didn't fling my chair back or drop anything. I just stood, took my cup to the sink, rinsed it, and turned to face him. Remained seated, eyes now on me, unreadable, but entirely focused. "You're not going to stop this, are you?" I asked. "No." "And I'm not going to either." He didn't reply. He didn't have to. I walked past him toward the hallway, not fast, not slow. I didn't glance back. I didn't need to. I knew he would follow. I stopped at the guest bedroom door. It was ajar. Inside, the curtains moved slightly from the open window. The air smelled like linen and wood polish. The room was unchanged, untouched, preserved like a photograph in an old frame. I stepped in, first turned to face him. He didn't speak, didn't ask, just watched me. I sat on the edge of the bed. He remained by the door when he finally crossed the room. It wasn't a rush, it was measured, deliberate. I could feel the heat of him before he reached me. He stood in front of me so close I could see the faint stubble on his chin, the small scar just below his collarbone, things I hadn't noticed before, but now couldn't unsee. He reached down, gently touched my jaw, just his thumb brushing beneath it. The kind of touch that wasn't possessive but undeniable. "I don't want to hurt anyone." I whispered. "I don't either." He replied, and then he kissed me. It wasn't urgent, it wasn't even deep. It was steady, slow, the kind of kiss that held restraint like a clenched muscle. My hands didn't move at first. I just let it happen. Let the sensation sink into me, the scratch of his shirt, the scent of his skin, the trembling I felt rising in my abdomen like a fever I no longer wanted to fight. When we parted, we both just breathed. No apologies, no declarations. The silence after that kiss was louder than anything else, and yet when he sat beside me on the bed, neither of us moved to speak. We just sat, two people now, defined not by what they hadn't done, but by what they no longer denied. I stayed until the streetlights came on. When I finally left, the hallway seemed narrower than it had hours before. My body felt both lighter and heavier. And as I closed the front door behind me, I understood something that both terrified and excited me. There would be a next time. Not because we were reckless, because now we had something worth returning to. I woke before him, not because of a sound or a dream, but because my body refused to let the day begin without a reckoning. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath beside me. My husband looked peaceful, relaxed in a way that felt foreign to me now. There was no tension in his features, no trace of the quiet war I was fighting alone. He had surprised me the day before with the idea of a weekend. Away, just the two of us, a short drive from the city, a modest hotel by the coast. No anniversary, no occasion. Just time together, a gesture perhaps, or a plea. I didn't recognize for what it was. I'd said yes immediately. Not because I wanted to go, but because I couldn't think of a reason not to. There was nothing left in me that resisted these small efforts anymore. And maybe that was the problem. I was done resisting, but not in the way he hoped. The drive was quiet. Spoke, of course, about traffic, about work, about a new film we hadn't seen. He reached for my hand somewhere along the highway and I let him take it. His palm was warm, familiar. A gesture from another version of our life. I held it because it was easy, not because I needed it. The hotel was pleasant. White sheets, wooden furniture, a small balcony with a view of swaying trees. We drank coffee together in silence, the kind that used to feel companionable, but now simply filled space. He looked at me with a kind of hopeful gentleness, like a man trying to remember how to love the woman sitting across from him. That night he touched me, tentative, almost shy, as if asking for permission with each movement. I didn't pull away. I didn't say no. I let it happen. I even kissed him back. My body moved the way it was supposed to, slowly, passively, politely. There was no resistance, but there was no hunger either. I watched the ceiling again as his weight settled beside me afterward. He exhaled, kissed my shoulder. I kept my eyes open, tracing the faint pattern of cracks above the bed, wondering how long we'd both been pretending this was enough. The truth was, it hadn't hurt. It hadn't repulsed me. But it hadn't touched me either. I felt nothing. And that nothingness frightened me more than guilt ever could. We drove back in the late afternoon. The light through the windshield cast long shadows across the dashboard. He talked about maybe repainting the kitchen, asked if I wanted to switch gyms. I nodded in all the right places, not because I was listening, but because I no longer had the strength to challenge the illusion. When we got home, the envelope was waiting. White plain slipped beneath the front door like an afterthought. I recognized the handwriting instantly, the blocky, almost too perfect print I'd seen on scrap notes in my mother's kitchen, on receipts on toolboxes. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name. Inside was a single line. "Are you still in that dress?" My breath caught before I could stop it. Fingers trembled slightly as I folded the paper again. I didn't even realize I'd started moving until I was upstairs, standing in front of the closet with the door wide open. I found the dress immediately navy blue, long sleeves, soft fabric, that clung to the waist. I'd worn it to my mother's house. I'd worn it the day he looked at me and didn't look away. The dress still carried the faint trace of my perfume of memory. I held it close to my face, pressing the fabric against my cheek. My eyes closed before I meant them to. There was no shame in that moment, only clarity. He remembered. He was watching. He was waiting. And something in me, something that had been dormant for far too long, responded. Not with fear, not even with excitement, but with readiness. There was no pretending anymore. Not between us, not within me, and not for much longer. It had been 4 days since the note. 4 days since I touched the dress, folded it back into the dark, and pretended not to check my phone every 20 minutes. I told myself it was just curiosity, but I knew better. When silence stretches just long enough to feel deliberate, it becomes its own form of communication. And his silence wasn't absence. It was waiting. Returned to routine work, groceries. Even smiled through dinner with my husband and one of his co-workers. I listened to their small talk, the mild laughter, the clinking of glasses, and wondered how many women had done what I was doing now. Sitting beside a man who had no idea that a single sentence from someone else could set her entire inner world aflame, I laughed at the right moments, crossed my legs, refilled his glass. I wore the role like a second skin, and underneath it, I vibrated with a kind of quiet instability. The message came early on a Thursday. Not a text, a voicemail, the kind he rarely left. His voice, calm as ever, said only this: "I need to see you. Come if you can." There was no address, no instructions, just a location ping. The gym, I hadn't known he even went there. I hesitated for all of 10 seconds before grabbing my keys. The building was sterile, and fluorescent rows of mirrored walls and treadmills lined up like soldiers. The receptionist barely looked at me when I passed. I wandered the corridor in a daze, as though moving through a place I didn't belong to. Everything smelled of rubber and disinfectant and something rawer underneath sweat heat. I found him in a smaller, back room. Not the weight section. Not the treadmills. A training room. Mirrors on two sides. Floor mats rolled to the corner. He was alone. Towel slung over his shoulder. Wearing a black t-shirt and athletic pants. I couldn't remember ever seeing him in clothes that informal. It startled me. He looked up when I entered. No surprise in his face, as if he'd been certain I would come. Maybe he was right. We didn't speak immediately. The silence wasn't awkward. It was thick, deliberate, like the pause before thunder. "I didn't know you came here." I said finally. "I don't. Not often." "You called me here for a reason." "Yes." He moved to the wall, picked up a bottle of water, took a sip, then leaned against the mirror with his arms folded. The reflection showed both of us, me, standing near the doorway, arms slightly crossed, unsure if I was shielding myself or just cold. Him solid and composed, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the calm. "You've been quiet," I said. I had to be. "Why now?" He looked straight at me. His eyes weren't hard, but there was no softness either. "Because I can't stop thinking about you. And I'm done pretending I should." I didn't answer. I stepped farther into the room. The floor felt too smooth under my shoes, the overhead lights too harsh. Everything in that room seemed to expose the body. Nothing left to hide behind. No curtains, no warm lamplight, just clarity. "I'm still married." I said. "He's trying. He's kind. I know. And I'm not someone who runs or lies. At least I didn't think I was. You're someone who's starving," he said, voice low. "And pretending you're full, that silenced me." Not because I disagreed, but because it was the first time anyone had said it aloud. I'd built an entire life around pretending to be satisfied, to be enough, to have enough. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just stood there suddenly, aware of how heavy my limbs felt. He stepped forward, only once, then paused. "I don't want a piece of you," he said. "Not a stolen hour, not a hallway glance. I want you when you're clear. When you stop apologizing for wanting you." Make it sound easy. It isn't. But it's real. I took a breath. It rattled in my chest like a question I couldn't answer. He reached for me, then slow controlled his hand, resting gently at the curve of my elbow. Not claiming, just anchoring. I didn't move. His skin was warm. I could feel the pulse under his thumb, steady and unashamed. My voice was quieter when I spoke again. "I can't go back to pretending. You already didn't." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand what that meant, yet my eyes caught the mirror beside us. Our reflections not intimate, not tangled, just two people standing close, the air between them, trembling. I saw myself clearly in that reflection. Not the version I showed my husband, not the careful mask I wore at work, but the woman who'd said yes to a meeting like this, to a room like this, to a man who made her feel like a match, poised above a dry field. He let go of my arm. Then slowly, he stepped behind me, just out of view, in the mirror. I could feel his presence at my back, the heat of it radiating toward me without touch. His breath was calm, measured. My eyes stayed on the glass. "Are you scared?" he asked. Voice near my ear. "I'm terrified." I whispered, "But you're here, I'm here." We stood like that for minutes, not touching, not speaking, just breathing in the same space, both of us aware that the next choice would change everything. Eventually, he stepped away, not abruptly, just far. "Enough, I'll wait for you to be sure," he said, but I won't wait forever. I turned to face him, not with guilt, with clarity. "I don't want forever." I said, "I want real." He nodded once, then left the room. First towel still, over his shoulder, walking like a man who had nothing to prove. I stayed there for a long time, watching my reflection, trying to recognize the woman who had just told the truth, finally fully and without apology. I didn't see him for 5 days. After that, not because I didn't want to, I wanted nothing more than to feel the silence between us fill again with the weight of proximity. But something about the clarity of that conversation, the mirror, the tension, the restraint had stripped away the excuse of impulse. Now, whatever happened next would be deliberate. I could no longer pretend I'd been swept into something by accident. I thought of him every day in details, in the strange, grounded way that isn't fantasy but memory. Rewound and reshaped his voice near my ear, his hand on my arm. The way he said he didn't want a piece of me, and how for the first time in my life I didn't feel flattered by the pursuit but seen by it. At home, I functioned, I performed. My husband had no reason to suspect anything, and that almost made it worse. His kindness now felt like a mirror of my deception. The better he treated me, the more I felt the cold edge of what I was keeping from him. But I also knew that if he had truly been looking at me for all these years, this version of me would not have come as a surprise. On the 6th day, I made a choice. It wasn't spontaneous. It didn't come from wine or anger or loneliness. It came from a quiet moment. At the breakfast table, when I realized I had stopped hearing the sound of his fork against the plate, I was staring at the toast on my own untouched, and all I could think about was the ache between my ribs, the one that hadn't left since. That day at the gym, I told my husband I was going to visit a friend. Not a lie, but not the truth. I packed a small bag, a change of clothes, a clean shirt, a pair of earrings I hadn't worn in months, and at the last second I folded the navy dress and placed it at the bottom of the tote. I didn't look at it, I didn't have to. He picked me up just after 3. He didn't ask questions, I didn't offer explanations. We didn't speak much in the car, and I was grateful for that. The silence didn't feel heavy. It felt chosen. It gave me space to feel the weight of what I was doing. He took the highway heading west. I didn't ask where we were going. I didn't need an address. The way he drove told me everything. Steady. Unfaltering, like a man who had made peace with whatever came next. His hand rested lightly on the gear shift, his eyes fixed on the road. But I could feel his thoughts in the air, pulsing warm waiting. We reached the outskirts of a small town I barely recognized. He pulled into a quiet gravel path that curved behind a shuttered bookstore and a narrow cafe. At the end stood a modest cabin, weathered wood, a single porch light. The kind of place people rented to be alone, but not to escape. It wasn't romantic, it was real. He unlocked the door and let me step in first. Inside, the air was still. A faint trace of cedar and linen. There were no dramatic gestures, no flowers, no music, just a clean room, 2 glasses on the table, a folded blanket on the arm of the sofa. I placed my bag near the foot of the bed and turned toward the window, watching the light as it moved across the floorboards. Behind me, I heard the quiet sound of him removing his jacket, then the rustle of paper as he placed keys on the table. Still, no words. None were necessary yet. It wasn't until I turned that our eyes met again. This time, there was no hesitation, no pause to calculate risk. Only presence. Awareness. He stepped closer. I didn't move. I thought I'd be more nervous. I said, my voice quiet but steady. "You're not?" "I'm exhausted." He reached up, brushed a strand of hair from my face. His hand lingered near my temple, not possessive, not searching, just there. "Then don't perform here." He said, "Not for me." I exhaled something like relief. I didn't realize how much of my life had been spent performing until someone gave me permission to stop. He didn't undress me. He didn't push. He simply held my face in his hands and kissed me, not with hunger, not with urgency, but with weight, with finality. The kind of kiss that doesn't try to seduce, but to anchor, to steady the chaos long enough for something true to rise to the surface. When we parted, I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I moved away only to slip into the bathroom, my fingers trembling as I reached for the navy dress, still folded, still warm from the bag. I changed slowly, methodically, as though each button fastened me to something irreversible. When I stepped out, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, head bowed slightly as if praying, though I knew he wasn't a religious man. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and the moment our eyes met, I knew. I wasn't here for escape. I wasn't here to betray. I was here because somewhere along the way, I had stopped belonging to the life I'd built. And he was the only person who hadn't asked me to apologize for it. I crossed the room. He stood. We didn't touch. Immediately. We just stood barely inches apart. The air charged with everything that hadn't been said and everything that didn't need to be. Then finally he whispered, "I'm not here to take anything from you. I know. And I won't ask for more than you can give. You don't have to ask. We move together." Then slowly, deliberately, not like two people chasing something forbidden, but like two people returning to something that had waited too long to be. Acknowledged, and as his hand slid gently across my lower back, as his breath found the curve of my shoulder, as my fingers finally relaxed into the warmth of his neck, I understood something simple and dangerous. I was no longer wondering if I would see him again. I was already thinking about when. The morning after didn't begin with regret. It began with silence. Not the kind that hangs after mistakes, but the rare, honest kind that follows clarity, the kind that doesn't rush to fill itself with explanations. Light crept through the cabin's small window, casting long lines across the bed, where I lay half-covered still in the navy dress, my arm curled beneath my head, the sheet barely touching the back of my legs. He had risen before me. I heard the sound of water from the sink, the rustle of fabric, the soft creak of the old wood as he moved around the kitchen. There was no urgency in it, no effort to disguise anything. He wasn't a man running from what we'd done. He was a man moving within it, solid aware. I stayed still, watching the dust shift in the sunlight, and wondered how a room so simple could hold so much of me now. The walls had no memory of us before last night, and yet they already felt more intimate than the home I'd spent a decade sleeping in. When I finally sat up, he turned and looked at me. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, he just held my gaze, and I nodded once because I couldn't yet trust my voice. My body was sore in places I hadn't felt in years, not from force but from the unfamiliarity of being wanted fully without shame. Even the ache between my ribs had changed texture. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like aftermath. We shared breakfast, wordlessly toast soft fruit, black coffee in plain mugs. He sat across from me, elbows resting on the table, his fingers tracing the rim of the cup, while I picked at a strawberry with the edge of my fork. It should have been awkward. It wasn't. When it was time to leave, he walked me to the car without touching me, not because he didn't want to, because he didn't need to prove anything anymore. I stood by the driver's side, keys in hand, and for a long moment, we simply looked at each other. My throat tightened, not with grief or panic, but with the weight of knowing I could no longer live on the fence between two worlds. "I don't know what comes next," I said, finally breaking the quiet. "You do." He said, "You just haven't said it yet." He wasn't wrong. I drove back with the window slightly open, letting the air sting my face, hoping it would ground me. My hands shook only once at a red light when I saw a couple in the car next to me, their fingers loosely entwined across the gearshift. Something about their ease, their unthinking closeness, cut deeper than any accusation. At home, the house smelled of detergent and roasted coffee. My husband had cleaned while I was gone, a gesture of care. Maybe guilt, maybe distraction. He kissed my temple when I walked in, asked how the visit had gone, told me dinner would be ready soon. I said all the right things. I even smiled. And then I went upstairs. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, slowly unzipping the dress I had worn the night before. It slid off my shoulders and fell to the floor like something shedding its own skin. I looked at my reflection, not for vanity, but for verification. My skin had changed, not visibly. But I could feel it. I was still me, but altered, not ruined, not ashamed, just changed. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I reached for the closet door, pulled out a robe, and wrapped it around myself. The soft fabric pressed against my bare arms, and I realized how long it had been since I felt that kind of texture with awareness. Most days I'd dressed with function in mind, but now I noticed the weight of each thread, the warmth at the nape of my neck, the looseness around my waist. Downstairs. He was humming, something quiet, tuneless, automatic. I paused at the top of the stairs and listened, one hand on the railing, the other at my side. I knew what I needed to do. Not today, but soon. He didn't deserve betrayal, but he also didn't deserve a woman who felt herself dissolving every time she was kissed out of duty rather than desire. And I couldn't keep being that woman. Not after last night. Not after what I'd allowed myself to feel when I walked. Into the kitchen, he looked up from the stove, smiled, and asked if I wanted wine. I said yes, though I wasn't thirsty. I took the glass, sat at the table, and watched his back as he moved around the pans and spices and half-chopped herbs. He still didn't know, but I did. This wasn't a story about falling in love. It wasn't a story about lust either. It was a story about permission. The permission I finally gave myself to want something more than comfort, something more than habit. Something that burned, yes, but also illuminated the parts of me I'd buried beneath motherhood, marriage, and manners. When dinner was served, I ate quietly. Thanking him for the meal, asking about his day, I even laughed when he made a joke about the neighbor's dog. I knew he loved me in his own way, but his love had long stopped reaching the places in me that needed to be touched. And now, someone else had. Later that night, when he fell asleep beside me, I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, not thinking, just knowing I would not pretend anymore, and I would not stay much longer.